Good morning. This is Rochelle O'Neill Thorpe. You know me in my publishing as the Majestic Crane. The crane is like the bird that brings babies, right? The stork. Well, it's a symbol of peace and prosperity, but also motherhood, right? Universal motherhood. I yesterday experienced something that reminded me to stay with my mission or the gifts that God had given me, which was language, and that was through inspiration and friendships that I made here in Boston. But the seeds were planted in Oklahoma with this reading of the story, The Crane Maiden, which was published and illustrated, the illustration by women who were from Hiroshima. And the artwork was so attractive to me as a child that was going through my first year of desegregated schools in Oklahoma. My teacher, it was my first time outside of an African American community that educated me. My schools were majority African American teachers, and the white teachers in our school were often Jewish because in the Bible Belt, they were also under a lot of pressure, and they were the most receptive to coming to the African American side of town to teach, not only in the schools, but my first ballet teacher, whose husband came to the YWCA on the northeast side of town, also taught us karate. And so it was during that time that we first learned about Bruce Lee in the 70s. And that, of course, coincided with what was going on in our personal lives, which was the Vietnam War. So as Martin Luther King was taking a stance and Ali against us fighting in Asia against other poor people, is because their own roots had connections with the oppression of Native Americans in this country. Georgia was the homestead of most of the Cherokee who were moved from Georgia into the new territories, which would have been Oklahoma, as well as where Malcolm Little's family settled in Nebraska. That area, that region, was mainly the land of what we would say Aborigines people that did not become part of the state until about 100 years ago. So 100 plus years for statehood in the southwestern region, because they were promised as part of the settlement and trade with the so-called civilized tribes. But what I wanted to share this morning was, the song Deuces, right? And during the 60s, this was a symbol for peace, right? So in dealing with a situation where I overheard a young man talk about Hiroshima didn't happen and making jokes he was a store clerk in the produce department of Trader Joe's near where I live, the most enlightened, you would think, community of Harvard Square and Memorial Drive, right? So you think all these people over here should be intelligent, should know better. But we learned with Trump that there are a great deal of people who still harbor certain enemies' thoughts, and they will speak them. I mean, he was actually talking to Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Ethiopian other store clerks when he was making this comment, and I, as an African-American woman, was coming by. He had no idea, neither did they, that I had been a dorm mother at Shoah Boston. President had told me, had approved me to be on campus. And that occurred during a time when African-American children were killing each other in Roxbury. My family lived on Cedar Street in Roxbury, and the Japanese students that we were host parents to would fill themselves, 7, in a taxi to come to our home during this time. So the person running the community for exchanges, her name was Faith Barkas, decided to bring me on campus so that they would not endanger their students who wanted to be engaged with our family. My husband at the time was an African-American historian, just graduated from college a few years prior to that. And he was showing them the PBS special called The Africans, and also Keep the Eyes on the Prize. So these young Asian American, not even Asian American, Japanese nationalist students came to our house to learn about the Black experience and the African experience. So much so that when I was a dorm mother at Showa and pregnant with my daughter, Nelson Mandela had come to Boston. Those students came in groves, not only to the United Methodist Church on Easter Sunday to hear Reverend Stitt speak. They walked with me from the train station all the way to the hat shell to put money in the baskets for Mandela being elected president of South Africa. So you see, my mother was born in the 40s. Her mother would have been pregnant with her during the war with Japan, okay? In Oklahoma, on a farm that our family owned since the ending of slavery. They were buffalo soldiers. So war has two elements, and the symbol of peace, see this, has two elements. The two fingers we use for peace, think about it. One points out your mistakes, and the other one gonna defend it, okay? You know what this stands for. MF, right? And this stands for, so together, peace is not a passive thing. What inspired me through my youth was a song by Michael Jackson, which I quote in my book, The Majestic Crane, which is, "Men of war, don't go to war no more. Study peace, because peace is what we need." Studying peace comes from first studying people, their cultures, their language, so you can communicate. And also studying war. Understand why we went to war with Japan. Why? We are serving to defend Japan so that there is not an infiltration again of the kind of mentality that was alive with Hitler and was aligned with that type of hatred. Hiroshima, no, it should not have happened. There should have been better ways to negotiate peace than destruction. Just like in Vietnam, the Agent Orange. So now we have COVID. We can't go to Tokyo for the summer games. We have to stop. There's a universal motherhood. There's something greater than who we are that said, wait a minute, this ain't happening. You ain't coming here. Let's stop and let's think about what is going on. So chemical warfare was dropped from the sky. But now we have biological warfare, which is created in a disease that became universal. And you want to say it started in Hunan, but it started in a laboratory. And we are all aware of that there was some biological chemicalization, or it wouldn't have been so prevalent. So pandemic, the major pandemic that we almost always have to defend ourselves against is hatred. Who you call an enemy. See, somebody can talk about someone as an enemy to someone who they think should agree with them, all right? Or stay silent. Never in a million years did I expect today, by buying some simple groceries on my way to Taekwondo class, that I would be so infuriated. I lost all grace, all composure. All this came out. But I had been praying all week for the peace of a friend's mom. My son's best friend growing up was Korean. After my husband and I divorced, he moved to Dorchester with his new wife, and they had exchange students from Korea. So by the time my son came to live with me, we shared our children through their upbringing. He not only had been raised at Showa, Boston from the age of 3, I was living in Cambridge and was writing my first book. And that is when the students, the 2 young women whose husbands were doctors, sat next to me in a cafe, translated my book, The Tales of Teacups. My book, The Tales of Teacups. into Japanese. This is a Chinese edition. And so, what attracted them to me? What brought us together? What made a pathway for a little girl in Oklahoma to become a dorm mother in Boston for Japanese students? Or for me to learn Mandarin and be the first student of color to go to Donghai University, and then to teach in Shuangyasan City in northern China, in Heilongjiang. What created that possibility is a universal love. Being taught from the age of 3 in Ebenezer Baptist Church, he's got the whole world in his hands. That was the very first song I learned in my Baptist church. I say my because it was my father's Baptist church. Before he converted to Islam, he was a Baptist. My mother's family was also Southern Baptist. They attended a small Baptist church in Davenport, Oklahoma. So those seeds of teaching me that God was universal love from age 3, those seeds, that mothered my spirit, that nurtured my experience, that opened the door to me traveling at age 19 as a civilian. I always have to say as a civilian, because we were in the Civil War, Vietnam War, and Pakistan, whatever war this country came to. The only war my family did not participate in was World War II and I and II, because they weren't allowed to. And then my grandfather had 14 children that he had to take care of. So he did not go to that war, but I'm sure many of his friends did or wanted to. So, my mother, as I said, was born in 1941, and her little mom, Irma Watkins, would have been going to church and praying for the world, praying for peace. I thank God every day that my uncles came back from Vietnam. They were not MIAs, they were not missing in action, and I know she was in that church every Sunday. So when I went to my Taekwondo class today, before the thing happened yesterday at Trader Joe's, I was praying that my friend's mom would have a peaceful Mother's Day, because he was the best friend, this Korean boy, of my son. And he would drive his mother's Mercedes, and the police would pull him over and give him tickets, whether he was speeding or not. Because they want to say, who was driving that car and who does he think he is? And the sidekick, the passenger ride buddy, would have been my son, okay, my oldest son. So one day I was at home. It was a winter's day, preparing for Christmas, thinking of the holidays. And I got this feeling through my entire body. I had the news on, and I heard Mercedes-Benz flew into the Charles River. I knew instantly who it was. This young man had just gone to the UN mock meetings with my son. UN, United Nations mock meeting that they have in high school, the club they both belong to. And I knew, I said, oh my gosh, Nguru, that's my baby. I knew it. So then I called my son's cell phone. I called his girlfriend's house. Luckily, the mother answered, said, oh, he's here, he's sleeping. He had no idea what had happened yet. So what I did, I said, ooh, he has no idea. But it was indeed who I thought it was, because he had just dropped him off to his girlfriend, now wife's house. So my son was not in the car, but his other friends were in the car. They had gone out, they had partied. He saw a state trooper behind him. He said, oh no, I shouldn't be in my mom's car. She told me not to drive it. She had told him not to drive the car anymore, so he's not harassed anymore, to drive a different car, not the Mercedes. He disobeyed. So out of fear of getting in trouble, he sped up a little bit, didn't have his seatbelt on, and lost control of the car. So while I'm in Taekwondo and I'm meditating that she gets through, and mainly I get through this Mother's Day, because I would love to see those children playing with my children and grandchildren and second generations, and the minute they would be working in the United Nations and doing other things. I miss this child. So I'm learning my different formations. And then new to me is this new black belt teacher. So our master was telling him to teach. He decided, instead of teaching, that he was going to inquire about how long you been here, who do you know, and all this stuff. But he didn't know that I was meditating for the peace of a Korean mom to get through Mother's Day. He didn't know that. But his inquisition made me feel that connectedness that people want to regulate who you know. Like my Chinese studies. I made straight A's in Chinese from day one. But when I returned to Taiwan, fluent in Chinese, could read everything, I had to pass classics in order to get a dual major, diploma as an Asian studies major. So the only person who taught Chinese classics was Mr. Cohen, Professor Cohen. He decided, oh, yeah, you speak well enough, you read well enough, I'll let you pass classics 1, you have to pass classics 2. Bet. So I took the class, I did the best I could. Remind you, I was just coming back from the East, still dealing with assimilating back into American culture. He decided at the very end, I mean, I got a C- in this class, hey, big deal, but I was ace in Japanese at the same time. He decided that I should not get the dual major because I didn't pass this class sufficiently. Mind you, Cohen, and I remember that. Deng Shouxin was my teacher, but Mr. Cohen was my classics. So he had the decision-making power over me getting a second major. I said, look, I studied Chinese for 4 years. I speak, read, and write. I am not going to stay here one more semester to appease your ego, to take one class again. Yours at that. So the regulator, the determining that I speak Chinese or another speaks Japanese, or that you are able to have relationships, take a Korean karate taekwondo class, and then feel the need that you have the right to determine or ask me, how is it that you are here? Well, number one, uncle, my very oldest uncle, Sonny, served in Korea. My father-in-law served in Korea. I can learn Korean taekwondo, the language, how to cook the food, if I so choose. In fact, why aren't we teaching Vietnamese in the school? We can teach Mandarin. We barely teach Japanese. Oh, but we're not teaching Vietnamese. Why? Why does Vietnam go unaddressed in America? I studied the Asian Development Bank as my course in the business school, because I was in the business school before I was in the Asian Studies department. So I decided to do that as my research thesis in undergrad, the Eisenberg School of Management. I saw how the cash flow came into Vietnam to rebuild her and to create alliances. So while we were doing this peace up in here, they were doing that over there. So peace is about this. I'm going to point out, point to the enemy and point out and learn that behavior. And then I'm going to make sure it's corrected. And that means you defend yourself against enemy thinking. And then if you must defend yourself against it, that means F it up, both verbally, politically, emotionally, whatever you have to do. That's what you have to do. That's peace. Peace requires an action. Pointing, defending, deuces. All right? Remember that. Deuces. That's the only way you destroy an enemy. You must teach the enemy, and you must, if he don't learn the lesson. So, men of war have mothers, but men of peace, diplomacy also have mothers. Think of Catherine. Think of Catherine Jackson, who raised a son to sing that song, who was the symbol of African American culture all around the world. You get off the plane in Asia, you see posters by Sony with Michael Jackson as the model. Okay, remember that. One child of this woman who had 9. Thank you, Jacksons. Thank you, Catherine. Happy Mother's Day. Shingil Home, your mom, Miss Home, thank you. And me and all the mothers that I got to nurture their daughters and teach them something from Japan, thank you. As my son who speaks fluent Nepalese, namaste. I see the God in you too. And for Su Baifan, 他请我到他老家，到双鸭山市，我的孩子在那边，他们现在是很大。So I went to China 20 years ago. What happened 20 years ago? 9/11, Aaliyah died. Also, don't forget, Ennis Cosby. Ennis Cosby was killed that same summer. You know how I know? Because like that young man in Trader Joe's, my husband was working for Olympia Sports. There were some young Russian kids making jokes about that killing. Ennis Cosby. And I was reminded of that last week. I drive Lyft. As I was parking the car, picking up a couple with a brand new baby, a woman in a huge SUV was pulling in front of the house on the wrong side of the street where my car was and barely squeezing past my car. When the couple got in, I said, "She's your neighbor?" He goes, "Yeah, she's Russian." I thought, oh my God. See, Europeans can come here from anywhere they want to. They come to America and they come here with their enemies in their head. And they spew that same feeling and emotions in their children, who then grow up in America with that same amount of privilege. So whether they were pilgrims, or whether they just got off of Ellis Island, or they just got off the plane, whatever your enemies were, you carried them with you in your spirit and in your mind. And you could regenerate that and nurture that. So now we're shocked that an immigrant like Trump was president and is still working on that agenda of creating enemies. So you know what that means? Those of us who love, those of us who create, we must teach our children about war and why people believe in enemies, and we must deuces. It takes that. Defend your thinking, defend your thoughts, speak intelligently, love. That's why I teach language. That's why I learn language too. It wasn't about cultural domination and infiltration. It was about, I love these people, my classmates, my friends. Started in high school. One little girl, 2 little girls, Gracie, Susan, Kwang, Gracie Moy, 我爱你的。所以那个时候，如果他们的妈妈、他们的爸爸教他们，你不要很人，你要认识他们。你认识 means get acquainted, get to know. See, knowledge is not just power, it's love. That's what, you nurture that. And so imagine what Faith Barker's experience must have been for her to say, we're going to have Rosheru as ro no kasan. You know what that meant for not just me, but for the world. Oh, and the enemy was waiting. Oh, after 2 years of being a dorm mother, oh, the enemy was waiting for me. It was going to destroy my motherhood with all it could. 30 years later, voila, voila, I'm still here 30 years later. My divorce was all of the Japanese students loved both of us. And then we get a divorce. Then adultery is created in the house that they provided for us. The enemy was waiting. But the Christ had already been present. The love had already been present. The seeds for my victory had already been planted. And my victory is my survival. My victory is my continuing to love and to teach. So mothers, keep doing what you do. Those of you who teach their children, peace. Keep it up.